He hired a private investigator to follow me, convinced I was having an affair. The detective found nothing suspicious about my activities, but what he uncovered about my husband's financial secrets destroyed everything Dan thought he'd built. Sometimes the person pointing fingers has the most to hide. The manila envelope felt heavy in my hands as I stood in our kitchen, staring at the return address I didn't recognize, Peterson Investigations, LLC. My coffee grew cold as I processed what this meant. Dan had hired someone to spy on me. After 12 years of marriage, after building a life together, after countless conversations about trust and communication, he had chosen surveillance over conversation. Inside the envelope were photographs, pictures of me at the grocery store, entering my yoga class, having lunch with my sister Rebecca, sitting in my car outside the veterinary clinic where I worked. Every mundane moment of my Tuesday routine documented with the clinical precision of someone building a case. The timestamps showed they'd been following me for weeks, capturing my boring, predictable life with the dedication of someone hunting a criminal. My hands trembled as I flipped through image after image of my ordinary existence. There I was, pumping gas on Tuesday morning. There I was, walking our golden retriever Max around the neighborhood. There I was, buying groceries, completely unaware that my husband had turned my daily routine into evidence of suspected infidelity. The violation felt physical, like someone had been watching me undress without my knowledge. The final photograph made my stomach lurch. It showed me hugging Tom Henderson, our neighbor, outside the hardware store. The angle made the embrace look intimate, suspicious, when the reality was far more innocent. Tom's wife had been diagnosed with breast cancer the week before, and I'd run into him picking up supplies for the wheelchair ramp he was building for her. The hug lasted maybe 10 seconds, a gesture of support between neighbors who'd known each other for 8 years. But through the lens of suspicion, it looked like evidence of an affair. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories of truth prevailing over paranoia. If you believe that honesty should triumph over unfounded accusations, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories. Now, let's see how this investigation backfired spectacularly. I sank into our kitchen chair, the same one where Dan and I had shared thousands of meals, planned vacations, discussed our dreams for the future. The photographs spread across our breakfast table felt like evidence from a stranger's life, not my own. The mundane moments that made up my days suddenly seemed sinister when viewed through the paranoid lens of someone convinced of betrayal. The investigator's report was thorough and professionally written. 3 weeks of surveillance had yielded absolutely no evidence of infidelity. My routine was documented with military precision. Monday through Friday, I left for work at 7:30, returned home by 6:15, stopped for groceries twice weekly, attended yoga class every Thursday evening, and had lunch with my sister every other Saturday. The most suspicious activity they'd recorded was my 20-minute conversation with Tom Henderson, which they'd accurately identified as a neighborly interaction rather than anything romantic. Subject maintains consistent schedule with no deviations suggesting extramarital activity, the report concluded. All interactions with male individuals appear platonic and contextually appropriate. No evidence of infidelity discovered during surveillance period. The professional vindication should have felt satisfying, but instead, it left me hollow. Dan had spent thousands of dollars and weeks of deception to prove what he should have known about me already. I wasn't capable of betrayal. I'd never given him reason to doubt my faithfulness. Yet instead of trusting the woman he'd married, he'd chosen to treat me like a criminal suspect. That evening, I waited for Dan to come home, the investigator's report hidden in my purse like evidence of his betrayal rather than proof of my innocence. When he walked through the door at 6:45, exactly on schedule, he looked tired but unsurprised by my presence. He'd probably been expecting this moment for weeks, wondering when his surveillance would bear fruit. "How was your day?" he asked, the same question he'd posed thousands before, but now it felt loaded with hidden meaning. Was he fishing for lies, testing my honesty against the evidence he thought he'd gathered? Routine, I replied, studying his face for signs of guilt or satisfaction. Yours? Dan shrugged, loosening his tie with the practiced motion of someone who'd been wearing suits for 20 years. Busy. The Patterson account is requiring more attention than I anticipated. We ate dinner in relative silence, the weight of unspoken accusations hanging between us like smoke. Every casual question felt like an interrogation. Every innocent comment seemed designed to trap me in some imaginary lie. The man sitting across from me had become a stranger, someone capable of systematically violating my privacy while maintaining the facade of a loving husband. After dinner, as Dan settled into his home office to work on what he claimed were quarterly reports, I made a decision that would change everything. If he wanted to play detective, if he wanted to investigate the person he'd promised to love and trust, then I would do some investigating of my own. The difference was, I would start with the evidence already in our house. Dan's home office had always been his sanctuary, a room where he handled his accounting practices' most sensitive files and managed our family's finances. He'd always been secretive about money, claiming it was boring and that I shouldn't worry about the details. You focus on saving lives, he'd say, referring to my veterinary work, and I'll focus on saving money. It had seemed romantic at the time, this division of responsibilities that allowed us to trust each other's expertise. But now, with the investigator's report fresh in my mind, his financial secrecy felt less like protection and more like control. If Dan was capable of hiring surveillance without my knowledge, what other secrets might he be keeping? The locked file cabinet in his office, which I'd never questioned before, suddenly seemed significant. The key was hidden exactly where I expected it to be, taped to the underside of his desk drawer with the kind of amateur concealment that suggested he'd never expected anyone to look for it. Inside the cabinet were files organized with obsessive precision, each folder labeled with codes that meant nothing to me but clearly followed some internal system of his creation. What I found in those files would haunt me for months. Bank statements for accounts I'd never known existed, showing deposits and withdrawals that dwarfed our known household income, investment portfolios worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, money that should have been reported on our joint tax returns but somehow never appeared on any documents I'd ever seen. Real estate holdings in other states, properties generating rental income that had never been mentioned in our financial discussions. The scope of his hidden wealth was staggering. While I'd been working extra shifts at the veterinary clinic to help pay for home improvements and vacation expenses, Dan had been sitting on investment accounts worth more than most people's annual salaries. The financial statements showed a pattern of systematic concealment spanning back years, possibly decades. But the most damning discovery was a folder marked Tax Strategies that contained correspondence with offshore banking institutions and detailed instructions for concealing income from federal authorities. Dan wasn't just hiding money from me, he was hiding it from the government, systematically evading taxes on a scale that constituted serious federal crimes. As I photographed document after document with my phone, my hands shaking with a combination of betrayal and fear, I realized that Dan's paranoia about my fidelity had been classic projection. The person in our marriage living a double life wasn't me, it was him. While he'd been convinced I was sneaking around behind his back, he'd been conducting elaborate financial deception that my imaginary affair looked like a parking violation. The irony was breathtaking. He'd hired a private investigator to expose my supposed betrayal, never imagining that his paranoid behavior might lead to the exposure of his own far more serious crimes. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually made me grateful to be alive. But as I prepared for another day at the veterinary clinic, knowing what I now knew about my husband's secret financial empire, everything felt different. The kitchen where we'd shared coffee for 12 years suddenly felt like a stage set for a play about a marriage that had never really existed. Dan left for work at his usual time, kissing my forehead with lips that now felt like they belonged to a complete stranger. "Have a good day, honey," he said, the same words he'd spoken thousands of times before, but now they sounded like lines from a script he'd been reading for years. After his car disappeared around the corner, I returned to his office with a sense of purpose that surprised me. If Dan wanted to play private investigator, if he wanted to dig into secrets and gather evidence, then he was about to discover what it felt like to be on the receiving end of a truly devastating investigation. I spent the morning creating copies of every incriminating document I'd found, uploading them to a secure cloud storage account that Dan would never access. Bank statements showing unreported income, correspondence with tax haven institutions, real estate documents for properties that had never appeared on our joint returns, investment portfolios worth hundreds of thousands of dollars that had been hidden from both me and the Internal Revenue Service. The evidence painted a picture of financial fraud so systematic and extensive that it took my breath away. This wasn't a matter of overlooking a few deductions or making honest mistakes on tax returns. This was a deliberate, calculated scheme to defraud the federal government of hundreds of thousands of dollars in owed taxes, conducted over a period of years with the kind of professional planning that suggested Dan had been living this double life for most of our marriage. By lunchtime, I had compiled a comprehensive dossier of Dan's financial crimes, complete with bank records, investment statements, and correspondence that proved both intent and execution. The question now was what to do with this information. My husband had violated my trust by hiring someone to spy on me, but I was contemplating something far more serious. I was considering turning him in to federal authorities for crimes that could result in prison time. The decision wasn't easy. Despite his betrayal, despite his paranoid accusations and privacy violations, Dan was still the man I'd loved for over a decade. He was still the person who'd held me when my father died, who'd supported my decision to become a veterinarian, who'd built what I thought was a life of mutual respect and shared dreams. But that man, I was beginning to realize, had never really existed. The Dan I'd married was a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide someone capable of systematic deception on a federal level. That afternoon, I made the call that would change everything. The Internal Revenue Service has a hotline for reporting tax fraud, staffed by agents who specialize in investigating exactly the kind of crimes I'd discovered in Dan's filing cabinet. The IRS field office was located in a nondescript government building downtown, the kind of institutional architecture designed to intimidate people who found themselves on the wrong side of federal law. Agent Chen met me in a conference room that smelled of coffee and contains the kind of furniture that suggested serious conversations about serious consequences. "I has evidence of systematic tax evasion by my husband," I told the agent, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was doing. "Multiple unreported accounts, offshore banking relationships, and real estate holdings that have never appeared on our joint tax returns." The agent, a woman named Patricia Chen, asked for basic information about Dan's profession, our address, and the scope of the suspected fraud. When I described the extent of the hidden assets and the offshore banking connections, her tone became more serious. "Ma'am, if what you're describing is accurate, we're talking about potential felony charges. Are you prepared for the consequences of filing this report?" I thought about the photographs of my innocent daily routine, about the weeks of surveillance Dan had conducted while hiding financial crimes that dwarfed any imaginary affair he'd been investigating. "Yes," I said, "I'm prepared." Agent Chen scheduled an appointment for the following Tuesday, giving me time to organize the evidence I'd gathered and prepare for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of my life. She also informed me that once a formal complaint was filed, the investigation would proceed regardless of my personal feelings about the outcome. There would be no taking it back, no changing my mind once federal agents became involved. That weekend passed in a surreal haze of normalcy, masking catastrophic change. Dan mowed the lawn, we watched movies together, he made his famous pancakes on Sunday morning, all while I sat on evidence that would destroy the life he thought he'd built. Every casual interaction felt like a performance, both of us playing roles in a marriage that was about to implode in ways neither of us could have imagined. Monday evening, Dan seemed unusually tense. He paced around the house, checked his phone constantly, and kept glancing out the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors. When I asked if everything was okay, he claimed work stress was getting to him. but his behavior suggested something more serious was bothering him. "The Patterson account is more complicated than I initially thought," he said, his fingers drumming nervously against his coffee mug. "There might be some irregularities that require additional attention." Looking back, I realized he was probably beginning to suspect that his financial house of cards was about to collapse. Maybe his offshore banking contacts had warned him about increased federal scrutiny. Maybe his tax preparation software had flagged some inconsistency that made him nervous. Whatever the reason, the man who'd been so confident in his elaborate deception was beginning to show cracks in his composure. Tuesday morning arrived with the weight of impending revelation. I'd taken a personal day from the veterinary clinic, ostensibly to handle some administrative tasks, but actually to meet with federal agents about my husband's crimes. Dan left for work at his usual time, completely unaware that his wife was about to hand over evidence that would trigger the most devastating investigation of his life. The IRS field office was located in a nondescript government building downtown, the kind of institutional architecture designed to intimidate people who found themselves on the wrong side of federal law. Agent Chen met me in a conference room that smelled of coffee and contained the kind of furniture that suggested serious conversations about serious consequences. I spread Dan's financial documents across the conference table like evidence in a criminal trial, which I suppose they were. Bank statements showing hundreds of thousands in unreported income, investment portfolios that had never appeared on tax returns, correspondence with offshore institutions that specialized in helping Americans hide money from their own government. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Agent Chen studied each document with the clinical attention of someone who'd spent years investigating financial fraud. She photographed everything, took detailed notes, and asked questions that revealed the true scope of Dan's deception. How long had I been unaware of these accounts? Had I ever benefited knowingly from the unreported income? Was I prepared to testify about my husband's financial secrecy if the case went to trial? "Mrs. Morrison," Agent Chen said, using my maiden name at my request, "what your husband has been doing constitutes serious federal crimes. We're talking about tax evasion, money laundering, and potentially wire fraud if he's been using electronic transfers to move money offshore. The penalties for these crimes can include substantial prison time." The reality of what I'd set in motion hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about betrayal or privacy violations anymore. This was about federal felonies that could destroy Dan's life completely. But as I thought about the weeks of surveillance he'd conducted, the violation of my privacy, the systematic financial deception he'd maintained throughout our marriage, I realized that the Dan who might go to prison wasn't the man I'd thought I married. He was someone I'd never really known at all. Agent Chen explained that the IRS would conduct its own investigation, interviewing Dan's clients, examining his business records, and coordinating with other federal agencies if the crimes crossed state lines or involved international banking. The process could take months, during which Dan would likely become aware that he was under investigation. She advised me to avoid discussing the case with him and to contact her immediately if he became suspicious or confrontational. As I drove home from the federal building, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I realized that I'd just triggered a chain of events that would destroy the life Dan had built on lies, while potentially destroying the remnants of our marriage in the process. But the alternative, continuing to live with someone capable of such systematic deception, felt impossible. The investigation moved faster than anyone had anticipated. Within 2 weeks, federal agents had traced Dan's offshore accounts, identified the scope of his unreported income, and calculated the taxes he owed in penalties and interest. The numbers were staggering. Over the course of 8 years, Dan had hidden nearly $1 million in income from federal authorities, owing taxes and penalties that would bankrupt him, even if he avoided prison time. Agent Chen called me on a Thursday afternoon with an update that made my blood run cold. "We're executing search warrants tomorrow morning," she said. "Your husband's office, his business accounts, and potentially your home if we believe evidence is stored there. I wanted to give you advance warning so you could make arrangements to be elsewhere during the search." The next morning, I sat in my car across the street from Dan's accounting firm, watching federal agents swarm the building where he'd built his professional reputation over 20 years. Black SUVs filled the parking lot, agents in windbreakers carried boxes of evidence to waiting vehicles, and Dan stood in the lobby, visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender and shock. His clients, arriving for scheduled appointments, found themselves turned away by federal agents, who explained that the office was temporarily closed due to an ongoing investigation. Within hours, local news outlets had picked up the story. "Prominent accountant under federal investigation for tax evasion," the headlines read, accompanied by photographs of Dan being escorted from his building by IRS criminal investigators. The irony was perfect in its cruel symmetry. The man who'd hired a private investigator to document my innocent daily routine was now the subject of a federal investigation that would document every financial crime he'd committed over the past decade. The surveillance he'd conducted on me would pale in comparison to the scrutiny he was about to face from government agents with subpoena power and access to banking records worldwide. That evening, Dan came home looking like he'd aged 10 years in a single day. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his confident demeanor replaced by something approaching panic. He sat at our kitchen table, the same place where I'd first discovered his investigation of me, and buried his face in his hands. "They know everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The offshore accounts, the unreported income, all of it. Someone gave them detailed information about my financial arrangements. They had copies of bank statements I thought were secure." I maintained my composure, playing the role of supportive wife while watching the man who'd violated my privacy face the consequences of his own crimes. "What does this mean?" I asked, as if I didn't already know the answer. "Prison," Dan said, the word hanging between us like a death sentence. "Federal tax evasion, money laundering, wire fraud. We're talking about years in federal prison, possibly decades if they decide to make an example of me." The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd had in years, possibly in our entire marriage. Dan confessed to crimes that went far beyond simple tax evasion. He'd been systematically defrauding the government since the early years of our marriage, using his position as an accountant to hide income and assets in ways that his clients trusted him to manage legally. Some of his clients had been unknowing participants in his schemes, their own tax returns compromised by his criminal behavior. "Why?" I asked, though I suspected the answer had more to do with greed than necessity. Dan's explanation revealed the depth of his deception. The hidden wealth hadn't been about providing for our future or securing our retirement. It had been about power, about having secret resources that made him feel superior to the ordinary people who paid their taxes honestly. He'd enjoyed the elaborate deception, the offshore accounts, the feeling that he was smarter than the system designed to catch people like him. "I never meant for you to get hurt by this," he said, as if my feelings were the primary concern rather than the federal crimes he'd committed. The money was supposed to be for us, for our future together. The audacity of his statement, coming from someone who'd hired surveillance to spy on me while committing felonies, was breathtaking. "Our future?" I said, my composure finally cracking. "What future, Dan? The future you built on lies and federal crimes? The future where you trusted private investigators more than your own wife?" His face went pale as he realized what I knew. "The investigator," he whispered. "You found out about the investigator." I pulled the manila envelope from my purse, the one that had started this entire chain of events, and placed it on the table between us. The photographs of my innocent daily routine scattered across the surface like evidence of his paranoia and betrayal. 3 weeks of surveillance, I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. Thousands of dollars spent documenting my grocery shopping and yoga classes while you were hiding nearly $1 million in offshore accounts. You hired someone to prove I was lying while living the biggest lie of all. The silence that followed was deafening. Dan stared at the photographs, perhaps seeing them clearly for the first time, recognizing how innocent and ordinary my activities appeared when stripped of his paranoid suspicions. The woman he'd been convinced was betraying him had been living exactly the life she appeared to be living, while he'd been the one systematically betraying everyone who trusted him. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice hollow with defeat. Since the day after I found these pictures, I admitted, I spent exactly as much time investigating your secrets as you spent investigating my imaginary affair. The difference is, my investigation uncovered actual crimes. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. The woman he'd been so convinced was deceiving him had been the one to expose his deception to federal authorities. The surveillance he'd conducted had led directly to the investigation that would destroy his life. The paranoia he'd harbored about my faithfulness had blinded him to the vulnerability of his own criminal enterprise. "You turned me in," he said, not a question, but a statement of horrified understanding. "You turned yourself in," I corrected, "the moment you decided that hiring surveillance was easier than trusting your wife. The moment you chose to violate my privacy instead of communicating your concerns. Every crime you committed, every lie you told, every dollar you hid from the government, those were your choices. I just made sure the consequences caught up with you." The next morning brought federal agents to our front door, armed with search warrants for our home and authority to seize any assets connected to Dan's crimes. I watched from the driveway as they systematically dismantled the life we'd built together, loading boxes of evidence into government vehicles while neighbors gathered to witness the spectacular fall of someone they'd considered a pillar of the community. The agents were professional and courteous, explaining that as Dan's spouse, I had certain rights regarding jointly held assets, but that anything connected to his unreported income was subject to seizure by the federal government. Our retirement accounts, our investment portfolios, even our home equity, all of it was potentially tainted by money that should have been reported to tax authorities. Agent Chen supervised the search personally, her presence a reminder of the conversation that had triggered this entire investigation. When our eyes met across the chaos of federal agents searching my home, she nodded with something that might have been professional respect. I'd provided information that would result in one of the largest tax evasion prosecutions in the district's recent history. Dan was arrested that afternoon, charged with multiple federal felonies related to tax evasion, money laundering, and wire fraud. The perp walk, captured by local news cameras, showed a broken man who bore little resemblance to the confident accountant who'd built his reputation on trust and financial expertise. The same media outlets that had once featured him in articles about tax planning were now documenting his fall from grace. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case explained that Dan's cooperation might reduce his sentence, but given the scope and duration of his crimes, prison time was inevitable. The offshore accounts had been frozen, the hidden assets seized, and his accounting license permanently revoked. Even if he avoided the maximum sentence, his professional life was over. As I sat in the empty house that evening, surrounded by the debris of a federal search, I reflected on the chain of events that had brought us to this point. Dan's paranoia about my fidelity had led him to hire surveillance that found nothing suspicious about my behavior. But my discovery of that surveillance had led to an investigation that exposed crimes far more serious than any imaginary affair. The private investigator he'd hired to destroy my reputation had inadvertently provided the motivation for me to investigate his secrets. The man who'd been so convinced of my dishonesty had been living a lie so elaborate that it involved multiple federal agencies and international banking laws. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. 6 months later, Dan pleaded guilty to federal tax evasion charges that would send him to prison for 8 years. The sentencing hearing was sparsely attended, mostly federal officials and a few reporters covering what had become a cautionary tale about white-collar crime in our community. I wasn't there to witness his final moments of freedom. By then, I'd filed for divorce, moved to a smaller apartment across town, and begun the process of rebuilding a life that wasn't built on lies and hidden criminal enterprises. The federal government had allowed me to keep enough assets to maintain basic financial stability, recognizing that I'd been an unknowing victim of Dan's deception rather than a willing participant in his crimes. The veterinary clinic where I worked had been understanding about the media attention and federal investigation, recognizing that I'd been betrayed as much as anyone by Dan's elaborate deception. My colleagues rallied around me with the kind of support that restored my faith in human decency, helping me navigate the legal complexities of divorce from a federal felon while maintaining my professional responsibilities. The private investigator who'd unwittingly started this entire chain of events sent me a letter months later, explaining that in 30 years of matrimonial investigations, he'd never seen a case where the spouse who hired surveillance ended up facing more serious consequences than the one being investigated. His report clearing me of any wrongdoing had been the beginning of Dan's downfall, though neither of us could have predicted it at the time. "Your husband spent thousands of dollars trying to prove you were lying," he wrote, while living lies that cost him his freedom, his fortune, and his family. "In my experience, the people most convinced their spouses are cheating are often the ones with the most to hide themselves." The letter arrived on the same day Dan was transferred to federal prison, a minimum security facility where white-collar criminals served sentences far from their former lives of apparent respectability. I didn't visit him during his incarceration, choosing instead to focus on building a future that wasn't contaminated by his deception. A year after the investigation began, I received a final communication from Agent Chen informing me that Dan's case had been closed and that his cooperation had led to additional investigations of his clients and business associates. The ripple effects of his crimes had exposed other instances of tax evasion and financial fraud, making his downfall a catalyst for broader accountability in our community's professional services sector. "Your decision to report your husband's crimes took considerable courage," Agent Chen wrote. "Federal tax evasion investigations often rely on information from family members who discover evidence of criminal behavior. Without your cooperation, Mr. Morrison might have continued his fraudulent activities for years, costing taxpayers hundreds of thousands in lost revenue." As I read her letter, I reflected on the strange justice of it all. Dan's paranoia about my imaginary betrayal had led to the exposure of his very real crimes. His lack of trust in me had resulted in consequences he could never have imagined when he first hired someone to follow me around town. The surveillance designed to prove my dishonesty had instead revealed his own systematic deception. 2 years after that devastating morning when I found the investigator's photographs, I was living a quieter life that felt authentic in ways my marriage never had. The apartment I'd chosen was smaller, but filled with things I'd selected myself, decorated according to my preferences rather than compromise. For the first time in years, I felt like I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted from life. The story of Dan's investigation and subsequent downfall had become something of a legend in our community, a cautionary tale that lawyers shared with clients contemplating divorce surveillance and that accountants mentioned when discussing the importance of legal compliance. His name had become synonymous with the kind of professional betrayal that destroys trust in entire industries. Dan himself remained in federal prison, serving a sentence that would keep him incarcerated until he was nearly 60 years old. His accounting firm had been dissolved, his clients' cases transferred to other professionals, and his reputation permanently destroyed by convictions that made national news in professional publications. The man who'd been so concerned about my theoretical betrayal had betrayed everyone who'd ever trusted him professionally. The private investigator's final report, the one that had found no evidence of infidelity on my part, remained in my files as a reminder of how dramatically life can change when paranoia meets consequences. Dan had paid thousands of dollars to prove I was faithful, honest, and exactly who I appeared to be. The investigation that was supposed to expose my secrets had instead exposed his own, far more damaging deceptions. As I reflected on that period of my life, I realized that Dan's greatest crime hadn't been tax evasion or money laundering, though those charges had sent him to prison. His greatest crime had been the systematic betrayal of everyone who'd trusted him, starting with the wife who'd believed in him for 12 years and extending to clients who'd entrusted him with their financial well-being and federal obligations. The woman Dan had hired someone to follow, convinced she was living a double life, had been living exactly the life she appeared to be living. The man who'd been so certain of her deception had been the one systematically lying to everyone who mattered. The surveillance he'd conducted had ultimately surveilled his own downfall, leading to consequences he could never have imagined when he first decided that hiring a private investigator was easier than trusting his wife. 3 years had passed since Dan was sentenced, and I'd settled into a routine that felt genuinely mine for the first time in decades. My small apartment overlooking the city park had become a sanctuary filled with books I actually wanted to read, art I'd chosen myself, and the kind of peaceful silence that comes from not constantly wondering what secrets were being kept just out of sight. The veterinary clinic had promoted me to senior partner, a recognition that came not just from my clinical skills, but from the leadership I'd shown during the chaos of Dan's investigation. My colleagues had watched me navigate federal agents, media attention, and personal devastation with a composure that surprised even me. Dr. Martinez, the clinic owner, had pulled me aside 6 months after Dan's sentencing with an offer that changed my professional trajectory entirely. "Sarah, what you've been through would have destroyed most people," she'd said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the serious expression she reserved for the most important conversations. "But instead of falling apart, you've become stronger, more decisive, more confident in your judgment. We want you to head up our new expansion into emergency veterinary services." The promotion came with a substantial salary increase and management responsibilities that challenged me in ways I'd never experienced. For the first time in my adult life, I was making financial decisions independently, building something that belonged entirely to me. The irony wasn't lost on me that Dan's criminal financial empire had collapsed just as I was discovering my own capacity for legitimate financial success. But the most unexpected development in my new life was the relationship that had grown slowly and naturally with Michael Chen, Agent Patricia Chen's younger brother who worked as a trauma counselor specializing in victims of financial crimes. Patricia had introduced us at a victim advocacy meeting, thinking we might benefit from knowing someone who understood the unique challenges of rebuilding after discovering a spouse's criminal deception. "Financial betrayal creates a specific kind of trauma," Michael had explained during our first coffee meeting, his gentle manner immediately putting me at ease. "It's not just the loss of money or assets, it's the realization that your entire understanding of your life, your security, your future was built on lies. The healing process is different from other kinds of betrayal because it touches every aspect of how you see yourself and your judgment." Michael understood the particular shame that came with being the spouse of a white-collar criminal. The way people looked at you with a mixture of pity and suspicion, wondering how you could have been so naive, so trusting, so completely fooled by someone you lived with for over a decade. He'd worked with dozens of clients who discovered their partners were embezzling, committing tax fraud, or running elaborate financial schemes, and he recognized the specific symptoms of recovery from this particular kind of violation. Our relationship had developed slowly, built on long conversations about trust, transparency, and the challenge of opening your heart to someone new when your previous experience had taught you that the people closest to you were capable of the most devastating deceptions. Michael had insisted on complete financial transparency from the beginning of our relationship, sharing bank statements, credit reports, and even his therapy notes about his own past relationships without being asked. "I know this might seem excessive," he'd said, handing me a folder containing every detail of his financial life during our 6th month of dating, "but I understand that trust for you isn't just about fidelity or emotional honesty. It's about knowing that the person you're with isn't living a secret life that could destroy everything you think you've built together." The gesture had moved me to tears, not because I'd been suspicious of Michael's honesty, but because he understood that my capacity to trust had been damaged in ways that might never fully heal. Dan's deception had taught me that the most dangerous lies weren't the obvious ones about affairs or addictions, but the subtle, systematic deceptions that operated in plain sight, hidden behind professional competence and assumed trustworthiness. Michael and I had been living together for 8 months now, in a house we'd chosen together and purchased with completely transparent financing that we'd both reviewed and understood. Every financial decision was made jointly, every account was accessible to both of us, and every investment or major purchase was discussed until we both felt completely informed and comfortable. It was a level of financial intimacy that many couples never achieved, born from my hard-learned understanding that financial secrecy was incompatible with genuine partnership. The contrast with my marriage to Dan was stark and instructive. Dan had always positioned himself as the financial expert, the one who understood complex tax strategies and investment vehicles that were supposedly too complicated for me to comprehend. He'd used his professional credentials and my trust in his expertise to create a barrier around our finances that I'd never questioned until it was too late. Michael, despite having a master's degree in psychology and considerable expertise in financial trauma, never positioned himself as more knowledgeable or capable than me. Every decision was collaborative, every explanation was detailed and patient, and every question I asked was treated as legitimate and important regardless of how basic it might seem. The goal isn't to become suspicious of everyone, Michael had explained during one of our early conversations about building healthy financial relationships after betrayal. The goal is to learn to recognize the difference between appropriate privacy and dangerous secrecy. Partners deserve privacy about their personal thoughts, their past relationships, their family dynamics, but they don't deserve secrecy about the financial foundation of your shared life. This distinction had become central to my recovery and my ability to build a new relationship. I'd learned to ask direct questions about money, to insist on understanding any financial arrangement that affected my security, and to recognize that a partner who was offended by requests for financial transparency was probably someone who had something to hide. The lesson had extended beyond romantic relationships into every area of my life. At the veterinary clinic, I now insisted on understanding the financial aspects of any partnership or investment opportunity. When my sister Rebecca had asked me to co-sign a loan for her daughter's college expenses, I'd requested complete documentation of her financial situation and a clear repayment plan, despite her initial hurt feelings about my lack of trust. "It's not about trust, Becca," I'd explained during a difficult conversation that had temporarily strained our relationship. "It's about making sure that everyone involved in a financial arrangement understands exactly what they're committing to. Trust is what got me into trouble with Dan. Clear agreements and transparent communication are what protect everyone involved." Rebecca had initially been offended by my insistence on formal documentation for what she'd considered a simple family favor. But after completing the paperwork and having several conversations about her financial goals and challenges, she'd admitted that the process had helped her think more clearly about her own money management and had actually strengthened our relationship by removing any possibility of misunderstanding or resentment. The ripple effects of Dan's crimes had extended far beyond our immediate family, creating waves of consequence that were still unfolding years after his conviction. His former clients had faced their own investigations, with several discovering that their tax returns had been compromised by Dan's fraudulent practices. Some had owed additional taxes and penalties, while others had been unwitting beneficiaries of deductions and strategies that weren't legally justified. The professional community had responded with a mixture of shock, anger, and soul-searching about the systems that had allowed Dan's crimes to continue undetected for so many years. The State Accounting Board had implemented new oversight procedures, requiring more detailed documentation of client relationships and more frequent audits of practitioners who handled complex tax strategies. Several accounting firms had changed their internal review processes, requiring multiple sign-offs on any arrangements involving offshore accounts or unusual investment structures. Dr. Patricia Chen had kept me informed about the broader investigation that had grown from Dan's case. His cooperation with federal authorities had led to the discovery of a network of professionals who had been facilitating tax evasion for wealthy clients, using strategies that walked the line between aggressive tax planning and outright fraud. The investigation had resulted in dozens of additional prosecutions, millions of dollars in recovered taxes, and significant changes to federal enforcement strategies for white-collar financial crimes. "Your husband's case became a blueprint for how these investigations should be conducted," Patricia had told me during one of our periodic check-ins about the ongoing legal proceedings. "The evidence you provided was so comprehensive and well-organized that it allowed us to move quickly and effectively. Without your cooperation, this network might have continued operating for years." The knowledge that my decision to report Dan's crimes had prevented other families from experiencing the kind of betrayal I'd endured provided some measure of comfort during the more difficult moments of my recovery. There were still nights when I lay awake, wondering if I could have handled the situation differently, if there had been some way to address Dan's criminal behavior without destroying his life completely. Michael had helped me work through the guilt and second-guessing that plagued many victims of financial crimes who'd been forced to take action against their partners. "You didn't destroy Dan's life," he'd reminded me repeatedly during our therapy sessions. Dan destroyed his own life by choosing to commit federal crimes for years while betraying everyone who trusted him. Your only choice was whether to become complicit in his crimes by staying silent or to do what was necessary to stop him from hurting more people. The therapy had been essential to my recovery, helping me understand that the shame and self-doubt I felt were normal responses to discovering that someone I'd loved and trusted had been systematically deceiving me. Financial betrayal, Michael explained, created a specific kind of psychological damage because it attacked not just your emotional security, but your basic understanding of reality. When someone lies to you about money, they're lying to you about the foundation of your shared life, he'd said during one of our sessions. Money represents security, future planning, shared goals, trust in each other's judgment. When you discover that your partner has been lying about money, you have to question everything you thought you knew about your relationship, your future, even your own ability to recognize deception. The process of rebuilding my sense of judgment and my ability to trust my own perceptions had been gradual and sometimes painful. I'd had to learn to distinguish between healthy skepticism and paralyzing paranoia, between reasonable caution and inability to form new relationships. The work had been complicated by the fact that Dan's deception had been so sophisticated and long-term that it challenged my fundamental belief in my ability to recognize dishonesty. The most dangerous liars aren't the ones who are obviously deceptive, Michael had explained. They're the ones who are selectively honest, who tell the truth about most things while systematically lying about the areas where they have something to hide. Dan was probably honest with you about his feelings, his daily activities, his professional opinions about tax law. That honesty made his lies about his own financial behavior much more difficult to detect. Understanding the psychology of Dan's deception had been crucial to my recovery, helping me recognize that my failure to detect his crimes wasn't a reflection of my intelligence or judgment, but rather evidence of how sophisticated and systematic his lies had been. Professional con artists and white-collar criminals often succeeded precisely because they were skilled at maintaining believable facades while conducting illegal activities in carefully compartmentalized areas of their lives. The realization had been both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it helped me understand that I hadn't been naive or foolish to trust my husband of 12 years. Terrifying because it forced me to acknowledge how vulnerable we all were to deception by people who were skilled at maintaining false appearances while systematically violating the trust placed in them. This understanding had changed how I approached all of my relationships, not just romantic ones. I'd learned to pay attention to inconsistencies, to ask direct questions about anything that seemed unusual, and to trust my instincts when something felt wrong, even if I couldn't articulate exactly what was bothering me. The hypervigilance had been exhausting at first, but gradually I'd learned to calibrate my responses, becoming more discerning about which situations warranted additional scrutiny. The veterinary practice had provided an excellent laboratory for developing these skills. Working with pet owners required a combination of empathy and professional skepticism, the ability to trust people's love for their animals while recognizing when financial constraints or other pressures might be affecting their decision-making. I'd become more skilled at having difficult conversations about money, treatment options, and long-term care planning, helping clients navigate complex decisions without feeling judged or pressured. My colleagues had noticed the change in my communication style, commenting on my increased confidence in handling difficult client situations and my improved ability to address financial concerns directly and compassionately. Dr. Martinez had specifically mentioned my growth in this area during my performance review, noting that my experience with financial betrayal had paradoxically made me more effective at helping clients navigate their own financial challenges related to pet care. "You have a way of talking about money that makes people feel safe," she'd observed. "You ask direct questions without making people feel ashamed, and you help them understand their options without making them feel pressured. It's a skill that's incredibly valuable in veterinary medicine, where financial stress often complicates medical decision-making." The observation had surprised me, but as I reflected on it, I realized that my experience with Dan's financial deception had taught me to approach money conversations with a combination of directness and empathy that many people found reassuring. I understood both the importance of financial transparency and the shame that people often felt when discussing money problems, and I'd learned to navigate those conversations in ways that preserved dignity while ensuring clarity. This skill had become increasingly important as the veterinary practice expanded into emergency services, where financial decisions often had to be made quickly under stressful circumstances. Pet owners facing expensive emergency treatments were frequently overwhelmed, both with the medical crisis and the financial implications, and my ability to help them understand their options clearly and compassionately had become one of my most valuable professional assets. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying, providing a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life during the years when I'd been unknowingly married to a criminal. Every family I helped navigate a difficult medical and financial decision felt like a small victory, a demonstration that trust and transparency could coexist even in the most challenging circumstances. My relationship with Max, our golden retriever, had also evolved in unexpected ways following Dan's imprisonment. Initially, I'd worried about how to explain Dan's absence to a dog who'd been deeply bonded to both of us. But Max had seemed to sense the change in household dynamics, becoming more protective of me and more attuned to my emotional state in ways that suggested he understood that our family structure had fundamentally changed. The decision about Max's custody had been one of the more painful aspects of the divorce proceedings. Dan had requested visitation rights, arguing that Max had been as much his companion as mine, and that he deserved to maintain that relationship despite his incarceration. I'd initially been inclined to agree, feeling that Max's well-being should take precedence over my anger at Dan's betrayal. But my divorce attorney had raised concerns about the practical implications of allowing a federal prisoner to maintain custody rights over a family pet. The logistics of arranging visits would be complicated, expensive, and potentially disruptive to Max's routine. More importantly, there were questions about what would happen to Max if Dan's sentence was extended or if he faced additional charges related to his ongoing cooperation with federal investigations. Pets aren't just property in divorce proceedings, my attorney had explained, but they're also not children with independent rights that need to be protected. The court's primary concern will be ensuring that Max has a stable, secure living situation with someone who can provide consistent care. Given your ex-husband's incarceration and uncertain future, you're clearly the more appropriate primary caregiver. The court had ultimately awarded me full custody of Max, with a provision that Dan could request supervised visits if he was released from prison and could demonstrate stable housing and financial resources. The decision had felt both fair and sad, recognizing that Max's bond with Dan had been genuine while acknowledging that Dan's choices had made it impossible for him to fulfill his responsibilities as a pet owner. Max had adapted to our new living situation with the resilience that dogs often demonstrate in the face of family disruption. He'd seemed to understand that our pack had been reduced to 2 members and had adjusted his routines accordingly, becoming my constant companion during the lonely months following Dan's sentencing. His presence had provided comfort and stability during the most difficult period of my recovery, giving me a sense of purpose and continuity when everything else in my life felt uncertain. The relationship between Max and Michael had developed slowly and naturally, reflecting the careful pace at which Michael and I had built our own partnership. Michael had been patient about earning Max's trust, never pushing for affection, but consistently demonstrating reliability and kindness. The breakthrough had come during a camping trip when Max had gotten sick in the middle of the night, and Michael had stayed up with both of us, helping me monitor Max's condition and making the decision to drive 2 hours to the nearest emergency veterinary clinic. "He's not just your dog," Michael had said as we sat in the clinic waiting room at 3 in the morning, Max finally stable and sleeping peacefully in my lap. "He's part of your family, which means he's part of mine too now. We take care of each other, all of us." The moment had crystallized something important about the kind of partnership Michael and I were building, one based on shared responsibility and mutual support, rather than the kind of compartmentalized relationship I'd had with Dan. Where Dan had always maintained clear boundaries between his responsibilities and mine, Michael approached our relationship as a genuinely collaborative partnership, where everything that affected one of us was relevant to both of us. The contrast extended to how we handled Max's ongoing veterinary care, which had become more complex as he aged and developed some of the health issues common to golden retrievers. Where Dan had always left pet care decisions entirely to me, viewing them as part of my professional domain that didn't require his input, Michael insisted on being involved in every decision about Max's treatment, not because he questioned my professional judgment, but because he understood that Max's well-being affected our entire family. "I may not be a veterinarian," he'd said when I'd initially tried to handle Max's hip dysplasia diagnosis on my own, "but I live with both of you, and I love both of you. That means I want to understand what we're dealing with and how I can help support his treatment. You shouldn't have to carry this alone just because you have professional expertise." The support had been revelatory, highlighting how isolated I'd been in my marriage to Dan, even in areas where his involvement would have been appropriate and welcome. Dan's compartmentalized approach to our relationship had extended to nearly every aspect of our shared life, from pet care to household maintenance to social obligations. He'd maintained clear boundaries around what he considered his responsibilities versus mine, rarely offering assistance or input outside his designated areas of expertise. Michael's collaborative approach required more communication, but it also created a sense of genuine partnership that I'd never experienced before. Decisions about Max's care, our living situation, our social calendar, and our financial planning were all made together, with both of us contributing our perspectives and expertise to reach solutions that worked for our family as a whole. The process had been challenging at first, requiring me to unlearn patterns of independence and self-reliance that I'd developed during my marriage to Dan. I'd become accustomed to making most decisions unilaterally, partly because Dan had been uninvolved in many aspects of our daily life, and partly because I'd learned not to trust his judgment about anything important after discovering his criminal behavior. Learning to share decision-making with Michael had required rebuilding my capacity to trust another person's judgment, a process that had been complicated by my fear of once again becoming vulnerable to deception. The therapy sessions had been crucial in helping me distinguish between healthy independence and defensive isolation, between reasonable caution and paralyzing suspicion. Recovery from financial betrayal isn't just about learning to trust again, Michael had explained during one of our couples therapy sessions. It's about learning to trust differently, more deliberately, with better boundaries and clearer communication. The goal isn't to return to the kind of blind trust that made you vulnerable before. It's to develop the skills to build trust systematically, based on consistent evidence of trustworthiness rather than assumptions or wishful thinking. The process had taken nearly 2 years, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs that gradually built my confidence in both my judgment and Michael's reliability. There had been moments when his kindness had seemed too good to true, when I'd found myself searching for evidence of hidden agendas or secret motivations. The hypervigilance had been exhausting for both of us, but Michael had remained patient and consistent, understanding that my suspicion wasn't really about him, but about my need to protect myself from repeating the devastating experience of Dan's betrayal. The breakthrough had come during a particularly difficult period when Max had required emergency surgery for a bowel obstruction. The incident had triggered all of my anxieties about financial security and shared responsibility, bringing back memories of how Dan had handled similar crises with detachment and financial secrecy. I'd instinctively tried to handle the situation alone, using my professional connections to arrange treatment and financing without involving Michael in the decision-making process. Michael had recognized what was happening and had gently but firmly insisted on being included in every aspect of Max's care, from consulting with the surgical team to arranging payment plans to taking time off work to assist with recovery. His response had been exactly the opposite of Dan's typical pattern, demonstrating genuine partnership rather than compartmentalized responsibility. "This is what families do," he'd said when I'd tried to apologize for the financial impact of Max's surgery. "We face challenges together, we make decisions together, and we support each other through difficult times. Max is part of our family, which means his needs are our needs, and we'll figure out how to meet them together." The experience had been transformative, providing concrete evidence that partnership could exist without deception, that shared financial responsibility didn't require hidden agendas or secret resources. Michael's transparency about his own financial concerns and limitations had actually made me feel more secure than Dan's false confidence and hidden wealth ever had. The incident had also highlighted how much my professional life had changed since Dan's imprisonment. Where I'd once felt isolated and defensive about financial discussions, I now found myself serving as a resource for other veterinary professionals dealing with similar challenges. The State Veterinary Association had asked me to speak at conferences about financial planning and crisis management, recognizing that my experience with both financial betrayal and recovery had given me unique insights into the intersection of personal and professional financial security. Dr. Morrison's story is unfortunately not unique, the association president had said when introducing me at my first speaking engagement. Many of us have colleagues or clients who've discovered that their partners were living double lives, hiding assets, or committing financial crimes. Her experience with detecting, reporting, and recovering from this kind of betrayal offers valuable lessons for our entire professional community. The speaking engagements had been emotionally challenging but professionally rewarding, allowing me to transform my painful experience into a resource for others facing similar situations. I developed presentations about recognizing signs of financial deception, protecting professional assets from personal financial crimes, and rebuilding career momentum after major personal disruptions. The audiences were typically composed of veterinary professionals, accountants, and other service providers who worked with confidential financial information and who were therefore both potential victims and potential early detectors of financial crimes. My talks focused on practical strategies for maintaining appropriate professional boundaries while recognizing when personal financial problems might be creating ethical or legal risks. The signs of financial deception often appear first in professional settings, I would explain to these audiences. Changes in spending patterns, unusual secrecy about income sources, resistance to standard financial documentation, requests for unusual payment arrangements. These behaviors might seem like personal quirks or temporary stress responses, but they can also indicate more serious problems that could eventually affect professional relationships and legal obligations. The presentations had led to consulting opportunities with professional organizations seeking to develop better policies for detecting and responding to financial crimes within their membership. I'd worked with the State Accounting Board to revise their oversight procedures, drawing on my experience as Dan's unknowing victim to identify gaps in their monitoring systems that had allowed his crimes to continue undetected. Mrs. Morrison's insights have been invaluable, the board chairman had written in a letter recommending my consulting services to other professional organizations. Her perspective as someone who lived closely with a professional who was committing systematic financial crimes, combined with her own professional expertise and her experience with federal investigation procedures, gives her a unique understanding of how these crimes develop and how they can be detected more effectively. The consulting work had become a significant source of income, allowing me to build financial security that was entirely independent of any romantic relationship. The irony wasn't lost on me that Dan's criminal behavior had ultimately led to career opportunities that I would never have pursued if our marriage had continued normally. His betrayal had forced me to develop skills and expertise that had significantly expanded my professional options and earning potential. More importantly, the work had given me a sense of purpose that extended beyond my clinical practice, allowing me to use my painful experience to prevent similar harm to other families. Every policy revision I helped develop, every presentation I gave about financial red flags, every consultation I provided to organizations seeking to protect their members from financial predators felt like a small victory against the kind of systematic deception that had nearly destroyed my life. The financial independence I'd achieved through this combination of veterinary practice and consulting work had been crucial to my ability to build a healthy relationship with Michael. Unlike my marriage to Dan, where I'd been financially dependent and therefore vulnerable to manipulation, my relationship with Michael was built on mutual choice rather than economic necessity. I want to be with you because I love you and because we built something together that's better than what either of us could create alone, I told Michael during one of our conversations about moving in together. I don't need to be with you for financial security or social respectability or any of the other reasons that might make it difficult to leave if things went wrong. That means you can trust that I'm here because I want to be here, not because I'm trapped by circumstances beyond my control. The conversation had been important for both of us, establishing that our relationship was based on genuine compatibility and shared values, rather than practical convenience or fear of being alone. Michael had his own career as a trauma counselor, his own financial resources, and his own social support system, which meant that he was also choosing our partnership from a position of strength rather than dependency. This mutual independence had created space for a kind of intimacy that I'd never experienced before, one based on voluntary vulnerability rather than forced dependence. We shared our lives because we wanted to, not because we had to, and that choice made every aspect of our relationship feel more authentic and secure. The contrast with my marriage to Dan was particularly stark when it came to long-term planning. Dan had always made major decisions about our future unilaterally, presenting them as accomplished facts rather than options to be discussed. He'd chosen our house, our investment strategies, our insurance policies, and our retirement planning without meaningful input from me, claiming that his professional expertise made him more qualified to make these decisions. Michael and I approached every major decision as a collaborative process, with both of us researching options, consulting experts when appropriate, and discussing the implications until we both felt comfortable with our choice. The process took longer and required more communication, but it also ensured that both of us understood and supported the decisions that shaped our shared future. When we decided to buy a house together, we'd spent months researching neighborhoods, comparing mortgage options, and discussing how to structure the purchase in ways that protected both of our interests while acknowledging our commitment to building a life together. The process had been meticulous and sometimes tedious, but it had also been transparent and collaborative in ways that had strengthened our relationship. "I know this might seem excessive," Michael had said as we reviewed the legal documentation for the third time before signing, "but after what you went through with Dan, I want to make sure that every aspect of our financial relationship is clear and fair and protective of both of us. I never want you to feel like you're in a situation where you're vulnerable to deception or manipulation because you don't understand what you've agreed to." The attention to detail had been exactly what I needed to feel secure in making such a major commitment. Unlike Dan's tendency to minimize the importance of financial documentation or to claim that complex arrangements were too boring for me to understand, Michael had insisted that I review and understand every aspect of our agreement before moving forward. The house we'd chosen was modest but comfortable, located in a neighborhood that offered good access to both of our workplaces and plenty of space for Max to enjoy his senior years. The purchase had been structured as a joint investment with clear agreements about how expenses would be shared, how equity would be distributed if we decided to sell, and how the property would be handled if our relationship ended. Planning for the possibility that things might not work out isn't pessimistic, Michael had explained when I'd initially been uncomfortable with some of the contingency clauses in our agreement. It's realistic and protective. The goal is to structure our relationship so that both of us can invest fully in building something together without being afraid that we're creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited later. The approach had required me to think about romantic relationships in ways that were initially uncomfortable but ultimately liberating. Instead of viewing discussions about money, property, and long-term planning as unromantic or indicative of lack of trust, I'd learned to see them as expressions of genuine care and commitment to protecting what we were building together. The security created by this transparency had allowed our relationship to deepen in ways that surprised both of us. Without the anxiety that came from financial uncertainty or hidden agendas, we'd been able to focus on emotional intimacy, shared interests, and long-term compatibility. The relationship had developed organically based on genuine appreciation of each other's characters and values rather than practical convenience or fear of being alone. 2 years into living together, Michael had proposed during a quiet evening at home, presenting me with a ring he'd chosen himself after months of research into ethical jewelry practices and sustainable sourcing. The proposal had been simple and intimate, reflecting the values that had become central to our relationship. "I want to spend the rest of my life building something honest and beautiful with you," he'd said, offering the ring with hands that shook slightly with nervousness. "I want to be the person you can trust completely, and I want you to be the person I can be completely honest with. I want us to face whatever comes next together with transparency and respect and love." The proposal had been everything Dan's had not been 12 years earlier. Where Dan had surprised me with an expensive ring chosen without input and a proposal designed more for dramatic effect than genuine intimacy, Michael had involved me in discussions about what kind of marriage we wanted to build and what kind of commitment ceremony would reflect our values and priorities. We'd spent months planning a wedding that was small, meaningful, and completely transparent in every detail. The guest list included the people who had supported us through the challenges of building our relationship, including my sister Rebecca, my colleagues from the veterinary clinic, Michael's therapy clients who had become friends, and even Agent Patricia Chen, whose investigation of Dan had inadvertently led to the beginning of our love story. The ceremony itself had been held in the backyard of our new house, officiated by a friend who understood the importance of the commitment we were making to honesty, transparency, and mutual support. The vows we'd written had specifically addressed the challenges we'd both faced in learning to trust again, and our commitment to maintaining the kind of open communication that would prevent the kind of deception that had destroyed my previous marriage. I promised to share not just my heart with you, but my whole life, I'd said, looking into Michael's eyes with complete confidence in the words I was speaking. I promise that there will be no secrets between us about the things that matter, no hidden accounts or private agendas or deceptions that could undermine what we're building together. I promise to trust you with my vulnerabilities and to be worthy of your trust in return. Michael's vows had been equally specific about the importance of transparency and mutual respect, acknowledging the particular challenges we'd both faced in overcoming the effects of betrayal and building a relationship based on genuine intimacy rather than convenience or fear. I promise to earn your trust every day through my actions, not just my words, he'd said, his voice steady with conviction. I promise that my love for you will be demonstrated through honesty, reliability, and respect for your intelligence and judgment. I promise that we will face life's challenges together as genuine partners who support each other's growth and protect each other's interests. The wedding had been attended by about 30 people, each of whom had played a significant role in our journey toward healing and partnership. My colleagues from the veterinary clinic had provided flowers from their own gardens, creating arrangements that reflected the natural beauty of our commitment without the artificial formality that had characterized my wedding to Dan. Agent Patricia Chen had given a toast that captured the strange justice of how our love story had begun with her investigation of my husband's crimes. Sometimes the worst experiences in our lives create opportunities for the best experiences we could never have imagined, she'd said, raising her glass with a smile. Sarah's courage in reporting Dan's crimes not only protected other families from financial harm, but it also led her to the kind of honest partnership that makes everything else possible. The toast had been both moving and slightly surreal, highlighting how dramatically my life had changed from the morning I'd first found those surveillance photographs in the manila envelope. The woman who had been so devastated by discovering her husband's paranoid investigation and criminal deception had become someone capable of building a relationship based on complete transparency and mutual respect. The honeymoon had been a modest camping trip to national parks in Utah and Colorado, chosen because both Michael and I preferred outdoor adventures to luxury resorts, and because the trip could be enjoyed by Max, who had become an integral part of our family planning. The vacation had been relaxing and romantic in ways that had less to do with the destination than with the security of being with someone I trusted completely. During quiet evenings around campfires, Michael and I had talked about our hopes for the future, our dreams for the family we wanted to build, and our commitment to maintaining the kind of relationship that could weather whatever challenges might come our way. The conversations had been marked by the kind of optimism that comes from genuine compatibility and shared values, rather than wishful thinking or desperate hope. I feel like we've built something that's strong enough to handle whatever life brings us, I told Michael as we watched stars appear over the Utah desert. Not because we're pretending that bad things won't happen, but because we've learned how to face difficult things together, honestly and supportively. The observation had proven prophetic when we'd returned from our honeymoon to discover that Dan was being released from federal prison earlier than expected due to his continued cooperation with ongoing investigations. His release created a new set of challenges that tested everything we'd built together and forced us to navigate complicated questions about forgiveness, safety, and moving forward. Agent Patricia Chen had called to inform me about Dan's impending release, explaining that his cooperation had been so valuable to ongoing prosecutions that federal authorities had agreed to reduce his sentence by 18 months. The news had been jarring, disrupting the sense of closure I'd achieved during the years of his incarceration and forcing me to consider how his return to civilian life might affect my own security and peace of mind.